Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third of our Cold War Symposium series. We did a kickoff meeting, and now we're on the third virtual event that we're doing. And welcome from wherever you are, from all the way around the globe in this case. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just as a warning, we are recording this video. And so anything you say can and will be held against you in a court of law. And we do have Dr. Eckhart here with us, so we can go right to and give you a lawyer. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about here's the purpose of our symposium. 30th anniversary of our Cold War, and just recently we saw the fall. We celebrated that the wall had come down. And this is, as I said, the third of our virtual events. We did Setting the Stage, Cold War Ends, and now we're doing Rebuilding the Alliance. And if you didn't get a chance to see one or more or attend one or more of the other events, you can find them on our webpage and go see them there. But before we go any further, I'd like to turn this over to Bob. And Bob Ulin, go ahead, and if you've got a couple of remarks, sir.
Okay, thanks, John. As most of you know, I'm the founder and director of the Simon Center for Ethical Leadership and Interagency Cooperation. And the Simon Center is a program of the CGSC Foundation, which is led by retired Colonel Rod Cox. This program is presented thanks to the generosity of our sponsor, Ferguson Development of Liberty, Missouri. John Ferguson has been a longtime supporter of the foundation, and we're grateful for his support. You only have to read and listen to the news to realize that many of the issues we struggled with during the Cold War are once again resurfacing. The key to European security over the past 73 years has been the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the willingness of their members to remain united. Today's presentation will focus on some of the challenges facing NATO after the demise of the Soviet Union. Our moderator for today's event is retired Lieutenant Colonel John Nelson, who is the Senior Research Fellow and Deputy Director of the Simon Center. John, over to you.
All right, thanks, Bob. We're going to go ahead and share the screen once again. This is the agenda that we're going to follow. Obviously, we've gone through the introduction by Bob. We are going to then, for each one of our speakers, we're going to give them approximately 15 minutes to speak. And then at the conclusion of their speaking, we will have 10 minutes of Q&A. All of the Q&A is going to be moderated by me. I ask you to put your questions, go ahead and type them into the chat pod of the Zoom window. If at the end, once we get to the Q&A portion, then I'll read out the questions and then we'll pose them to the individual speakers. If we do have some time at the very end, we'll allow for some just open dialogue, but I do ask you to use that chat up front. And it also helps us not to step on one another in terms of, for disruptions. It's really kind of difficult with Zoom to do a conversation with 30, 40 people at once. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and transition into our first speaker, who is Colonel Retired William Eckhart. He's Emeritus Teaching Professor of Law and Director of Urban Affairs Outreach at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Bill practiced law for 30 years with the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps, retiring as a colonel. During his career, he provided legal services, litigated in federal and military courts, taught at the University of California at Berkeley, the U.S. Army Commandant General Staff College, and taught and held the Dwight David Eisenhower Chair of National Security at the Army War College. During the period under discussion, Colonel Eckhart was a legal advisor to the American European Command. Since 1993, he has taught law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law, where he has twice been selected Teacher of the Year by his students and was awarded the university's Pearson Award for Excellence in Teaching. Professor Eckhart received his Bachelor of Arts with honors from the University of Mississippi his LLB with honors from the University of Virginia Law School, and his LLM equivalent with honors from the Judge Advocate General School. He is a graduate of the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College and the Army War College. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to you, sir.
Thanks, John. And if we could have the first slide, please. The Berlin Wall fell with lightning speed, and the resulting practical thunderclap was immediate. As a legal advisor to the European combatant commander, my professional world immediately changed. Suddenly, I found myself not only observing historic change, but also participating in the process. After setting the stage, as John said, and after reporting on the Cold War ending, this conference is turning from the past to the future. My assigned task is to relate and to record events personally observed as they occurred during the twilight era, when the past instantly turned into the future during the birth of a new European order. Time constraints necessitate topic selection. My written chapter additionally will include recounting the making of new United States strategy for Europe and the reporting on the coordinated democratization efforts by both the German and the American governments. Next slide, please, John. Our world changed with unusual military-to-military contacts with members of the Warsaw Pact countries. The pattern of these contacts began with an astonishing event. My neighbor, Navy chaplain, Captain Ray Dressler, was attending a routine international chaplains conference in Switzerland. He looked up from the breakfast table one morning to see a Russian Orthodox priest standing at the table. The priest inquired if Chaplain Dressler would have time to see the patriarch. Replying, of course, he was led to the patriarch's hotel room. As the door opened, in a booming voice and in perfect English, the patriarch exclaimed, "I need your help in reestablishing a chaplaincy within the Russian army." What a signal for change. Perhaps because the invitation came from the patriarch himself, such a revolutionary anti-communist suggestion opened the door. Warsaw Pact countries immediately invited Chaplain Dressler to visit their countries, and a pattern of military-to-military contacts developed. Obviously, the formal agenda avoided contentious matters related to the combat arms, yet it was the much broader and more political informal agenda that dominated. At supposedly low-key receptions, every single Warsaw Pact ambassador attended to make certain that his country was noticed, and often came to deliver very specific messages. These initial military-to-military contacts facilitated later important, extensive governmental dialogue on unique and unexpected subjects. Soon thereafter, the United States received an invitation to visit Romania to provide advice on how to restructure the Romanian national security legal apparatus, and I was instructed to organize and to lead our delegation. From the American point of view, we were interested in assessing the status of the concept of the rule of law in Romania and in observing conditions within the military establishment in general. Observations of Romanian society began on the flight tarmac in Germany. After everyone was seated, 5 distinguished men with obvious military bearing and haircuts entered the plane as a noticeable group, apparently senior German military officers. The competition for Eastern Europe had begun. My seat companion was an articulate secretary in the German embassy in Bucharest. She was returning to her post after depositing her son with her parents because she could not find a steady source of food for him in Bucharest. She related that the average citizen had to spend 1 to 2 hours each day in search of basic food and other necessities. Some hours later, we landed on a dark, rainy Romanian runway where an armed soldier stationed every 50 yards as we taxied to the terminal. We were instructed to remain seated and sat waiting for some minutes. Eventually, a senior Romanian military officer arrived and insisted that everyone remain seated. Then he invited by name and rank us to the plane. Our bags had been collected and we were immediately escorted to a waiting car, driven to our quarters, at the house of the United States Defense Attaché, where we were guarded by a platoon of soldiers stationed in the basement and on the floor above us. Our first official day began with an introduction of our respective delegations. The presiding officer gave a very lengthy introduction of me, including material that was not on record. Pointedly, they had been spying on me, a tactic of competitive one-upsmanship. During the traditional exchange of gifts, I observed that all was not what it seemed. Gifts on such occasions are usually just inexpensive yet symbolic. I normally use the book, The Killer Angel, because this remarkable story of one of our best citizen soldiers who literally saved the Republic at the Battle of Gettysburg made an appropriate statement. As I handed the book to the general officer in the room, I thought he was going to drop it. With embarrassing speed, he handed it to the colonel who was doing most of the talking. Obviously, the real power was not in the normal chain of command. Soon afterward, we were driven to the Romanian Supreme Court. And as is true in many Eastern European countries, there is a national security section. The chief of that section was a major general who would be our host. We were ushered into a courtroom and, to our utter surprise, witnessed one of the ongoing trials involving the overthrown dictator Nicolae Ceausescu's henchmen. We then entered the chief judge's office and were introduced to a remarkable major general. While sharing his hospitality of Romanian vodka, he related his legal career. He began with two remarkable statements. I am an old, broken man. All I can do is be. He explained that as a major, he was ordered to sign a legal decree and refused. He was sent to prison. After a year, he was told that if he signed the decree, he would be freed. Again, he refused. After years 2 and 3, the same process was repeated. He was then required to divorce his wife, and another year in jail followed. Finally, the officials simply gave up and released him. His wife met him at the prison gate, and hand in hand, they went to the priest and were remarried. Apparently, this remarkable story was well known and set an example and gave inspiration to others. As he said, my lieutenant colonels in that courtroom that you saw are terrified. Hopefully, by my presence, they will be encouraged. It became quite obvious to us that respect for the rule of law had not been extinguished. Our schedule provided for a touring day break, and as is often the structure for such exchanges, but as frequently happens, the day off becomes the most important day. That is exactly what transpired because of legal due process concepts shared and because the Romanians chose this day for their important political messaging. We were scheduled to visit the elite Spetsnaz Brigade, their legendary warfighters located in the Transylvania region near the famed Dracula Castle. This involved a several-hour bus ride. We were placed on a communist bus, a totally reconfigured bus with some 5 separate seating arrangements around 3 desks. The floor was elevated and the windows darkened, enabling us to see out, but we couldn't be seen from the street. This became the perfect occasion for floating informal discussions. Our most important work was done during the bus ride as our host moved among us, asking about legal concepts that I will label due process concerns. This was their chance to ask informally one-on-one about all aspects of American civilian and military legal systems. For a country in the midst of reform, this provided the perfect opportunity to probe the American common law system. I was amazed at their eager interest and their organized prodding. This was the official reason the Romanians invited us. As I suspected, it was not some grand structural overhaul that interested them, but a better understanding of basic concepts that they might later insert into their eventual reform. As we departed Bucharest for the Transylvania countryside, I observed one of the most disturbing sights of our trip, environmental disaster. For a distance of some 5 miles, the landscape was like the surface of the moon. A formerly forested area contained dead trees with not one sprig of green anywhere. Everything was covered with white chalk dust, with no evidence of human or animal life. I was aghast and now understood the words environmental devastation. After our arrival at the Spetsnaz Brigade headquarters, we were unexpectedly invited to observe a military demonstration and were escorted to the bleachers. There appeared a small platoon of mountain grenadiers with a horse-mounted officer and a mule carrying a small artillery piece. The unit stopped in front of us, removed the field piece from the back of the mule, disassembled and reassembled it, and again strapped it to the mule's back. The officer then mounted his horse, turned toward us, saluted us with a sword, and the platoon marched off into the horizon. Romanian history both explained and underscored what we had just witnessed. Romanian mountain grenadiers were such effective and feared fighters that both the Hohenzollern rulers and the later communists forbid such units from organizing. This organized demonstration that we observed was a strong political signal that independent, historic Romanian armed forces were organized and ready to defend their newfound freedom. Lunch was at the brigade mess area, and we received our second important political message. As we gathered, the commander motioned for me to follow him to a prominent window with a magnificent view. He related that his father had also commanded the brigade and that he was present in this very room at the end of World War II. He stated, "We prayed." Although he spoke flawless English, he instructed that the word prayed be translated 3 times. We prayed that the Americans would come, and with unusual emphasis, you did not. Then reaching a crescendo, he fairly shouted, "Let us in Europe." The Romanians' most important political message had been delivered. Several events in Bucharest. Next slide, please, John. Several events in Bucharest provided an unusual glimpse into evolving Romanian society. One of the more unusual occurred with my Romanian major communist minder. As was customary, I was assigned a military escort whose task it was to be with me at all public times and to report on my every action and especially my communication. Every day after one day after he carefully observed that we were absolutely alone, he informed me that he wanted a favor. Surprised, I asked him what he wanted. "I need a Bible," he said. "The ink has been worn off the pages of our Bible and we need a new one. English is fine, but please with study notes." I assured him I could do that. Formal lunches at the military club in Bucharest also provide interesting insights. This classic structure located in the very center of the city was impressive. Its grand dining room palatial. Upon entry, it was obvious that we were center stage, seated at a long formally set table and individually served by a staff of 12 young Romanian cadets. Knowing the food scarcity, I felt guilty throughout the meal. If the salad plates contained sliced pickles, as they did, there was absolutely no lettuce in the entire city. Our meals were so copious that we only wanted to eat once a day. At the conclusion of such meals, I always asked that the servers be assembled so that we could personally thank them. To my surprise, as I shook each hand, they leaned toward me and repeated phrases like, "God bless America," done surreptitiously and at great risk. But perhaps such behavior was not surprising since this was day 1 of the first Gulf War and full attention was focused on the United States. Earlier, traffic was so congested that it became appropriate for me to walk some 2 blocks to the military club. I was dressed in full uniform. When I stepped from the car, the reaction on the crowded street was instantaneous. Commotion everywhere. Some cursed and shook their fists. A much larger number shouted, "God bless America." Some spat in my path. Others attempted to kiss my hand and for pity's sakes, even my shoes. Needless to say, I was glad when I finally reached the steps of the club. At the conclusion of our trip, our host, the military attaché, hosted a small reception for us. We should not have been surprised, but were, because the usual reception pattern established by Chaplain Dressler's various visits repeated itself. 4 times as many people attended as were invited. Thank heavens for the flexibility of our host. Every single Warsaw Pact ambassador was present and insisted on being formally introduced to me. But it was the verbal exchange with the various Warsaw Pact ambassadors that said it all. Every one of them leaned toward me and whispered, "Steady, steady, steady," or "God bless America." America was clearly being cheered as a steadying hand managing a revolutionary change. Indeed, the hand of Eastern Europe was outstretched in friendship, anticipating a new era. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, sir. If you'd like, I'll remind everyone, please go ahead. If you have a question, go ahead and put your question in the chat. General Davis, you have your hand up. So was that a hand up or is that a clap?
That was a clap. I just want to say, well done, Bill. Enjoyed that personal anecdote. And I think many of us relate to your experience in Romania. I have some from Albania, from Russia, other things. Very similar in terms of both tone and experience. But well done.
Boy, we really had to rise to a different occasion, didn't we, generals? Who would ever have thought?
Okay, so I'm going to start off the Q&A then. And Bill, what was your observation of the Romanian soldiers? You spent some time looking at them. What was your impression?
Well, I didn't get to see them in the field, but when we were at the headquarters, we asked to speak with them. And to our surprise, they gathered the entire brigade in a room. A usual communist fashion, the women in the kitchen were on the front row. And you can look out over a sea of faces, young men, 18 to 22, bright, patrician and peasant, eager. What turned out that this was the first time this group of very bright, self-selected soldiers had a chance to ask questions publicly. So we had a dialogue with them, and it was quite intense and very good. And then something very strange happened. They asked a question, what to my Lieutenant Colonel Marine, what it was like to be a Marine, and he stood up and related to them that he was born 200 miles away, that he fled on the train, his mother, the last one to get him out. He talked about what it was like to come to the United States, what it was like to know you couldn't go home again, what it was like to decide to live in the United States and do what you can, and how proud he was to be a Marine, described his military training and thing. And the tears ran down his cheeks when he did it, and you could have heard a pin drop. And John, I think it was, for us, it was just a godsend, because it was a way soldiers could communicate about something that was important. And that was my observation. Young men, very bright, very articulate, ready to explore their new freedom.
Gotcha. Now, yeah, I noted from your talk, it kind of struck me the one group that, or the organization you had observed the demonstration on, and they were using mules. How were they equipped in general?
Well, I thought we'd gone back to the Greek Civil War, to be blunt, John. I mean, it was just right out of that playbook. There were about 14 in this platoon. They were all on foot except for the officer. They were carrying rifles, and their point was that their mountain grenadiers were organized, and they just made a point of doing a demonstration in front of us and making that political point with the military demonstration.
Sure. So were there any other outreach efforts of significance that you had a chance to observe?
I would comment on two. When things became a little more regularized, the United States, and it's not just lawyers, it's doctors and engineers and others, you try to get a professional organization together so that the Warsaw Pact countries can communicate with each other as they go through their reform. And so we did a lot of that. Democratization efforts were pretty extensive, and I suppose a high water mark came with that when the German and American governments assembled all of the ministers of defense of the Warsaw Pact countries in Heidelberg. And it was my task to go and talk about the role of a soldier in a democracy, probably the most difficult speaking assignment I ever had. But I think the American citizens would be proud of the two countries who did their dead level best to facilitate this transition to a more democratic system.
Sure. We have time for another question or so. Does anybody have anything else? Okay, see.
Could I offer an observation or comment? When I was a deputy commandant at the Staff College, we had a 2-officer delegation from Romania who came to visit, and it was a little unclear what their purpose was, but in the privacy of my office, they made it very clear that they wanted to find a way to get officers qualified to attend the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, that they desperately needed that kind of professional education, and they were very interested in developing a relationship with the United States military toward that end. Very well-spoken individuals, but a little bit socially awkward. This was in the late 80s, before your experience, Bill. And I just noted that their uniforms, while they were well dressed in their best uniforms, it looked, the tailormanship, if you will, looked like something that came out of our country in the 30s, maybe something like that. It was the best they had, but it was noticeably a quality step below what we had. So there's other things I can share about a exercise with the Polish in the late 80s as well, and their expressed interests in standing on their own 2 feet and no longer being subservient to the Russians. This, you know, there's a road leading up to your experience, Bill, that was started, I think, back in the 86, 87 time frame actively, and maybe subversively well before that.
All comes together, doesn't it?
Yeah.
John, may I offer an observation from Arizona?
Absolutely, sir. Go ahead.
Piggybacking off General Miller's observation, when I was on the faculty there, about 4 years ago now, I had a Romanian student, first-grade student, spoke beautiful English, and I stay in contact with he and his family probably 4 to 5 times a week. And it has been that way since he went back after Command General Staff College. I bet 4 to 5 times a week. Yeah.
Wow. Any other questions or comments for our speaker? Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
And so now we're going to move on to our next speaker. Is Major General Retired Gordon Skip Davis Jr., who is a senior fellow at the Center for European Analysis or European Policy Analysis. He recently served as NATO's Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment. Prior to NATO, Skip served 37 years in the U.S. Army, retiring as a Major General. Skip's last positions as a general officer included Director of Operations, U.S. European Command, Commander of Combined Security Transition Command in Afghanistan, and Director of Operations and Intelligence for Allied Command Operations. Skip's professional life included operational and institutional assignments interspersed with study and practice of international affairs and defense issues, primarily in Europe. Skip's career included assignments and operations with U.S., NATO, and UN forces in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Skip brings practical experience and conceptual understanding of contemporary and emerging defense issues, as well as executive level experience in operations, intelligence, leader development, capability development, and policy development. Skip holds an undergraduate degree in nuclear physics and graduate degrees in international business, defense, and military history and strategic studies. Sir, the floor is yours, and I'll bring your slides up now.
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first thank Bob Ulin, the Simon Center, and of course, the CGSC Foundation for the invitation to participate in today's symposium. Next slide. I'm going to talk about how global events, political conditions, and policy decisions have led to a NATO military transformation over the last 20 years. Over this period, NATO has experienced a pivot of its balance of effort, first towards crisis management, then back to collective defense. Now, NATO's transformation is not complete. It's still ongoing and requires follow-through by political and military leaders to implement and resource, as well as increased efforts. Let me go, if you go to my second slide. There we go. There we go. That's it. That's right. And requires follow-through by political and military leaders. No, back one.
Back one, sorry.
There you go.
There we
There you
go.
go. Yep, that's on the bottom line in 3 questions. There you go. Okay. I was going to say that the NATO's transformation is not complete, still ongoing. It requires follow through by political and military leaders to implement and resource, as well as increased efforts at the national, multinational, and collective levels to address agreed priorities. In a broader sense, NATO has embraced continuous adaptation and a longer ranging view through a new strategy, new concepts, and planning processes. Now, for you Latin lovers, pun intended, my presentation is going to cover 3 questions. So next slide. Ubi fuimus? Where were we in 2001? At the outset of 2001, NATO had experienced a decade of interventions in the Balkans. NATO stood at 19 and was implementing the latest strategic concept. The United States was an unopposed geopolitical power. Russia was still struggling with transition to a market economy, had a second war in Chechnya to manage, and Vladimir Putin had just begun the first of many terms. China was a distant, growing regional power. The prevailing threats were terrorism, ethnic strife, and instability in the Balkans, Middle East, and Africa. Russia was a nominal partner, but NATO-Russia tensions had peaked during the recent Kosovo conflict. The latter would leave scars. NATO military forces had drastically reduced in size and had reoriented to peace support operations, as well as partnership efforts with former Warsaw Pact countries. The 1999 strategic concept included several key adjustments. Among these were a broader focus on security, a new assessment of risks, and a new definition of NATO's fundamental tasks. The new definition of security recognized political, economic, social, and environmental factors in addition to military ones. And risks included terrorism, ethnic conflict, human rights abuses, political instability, economic fragility, and the spread of WMD. NATO's fundamental tasks were now security, consultation, and deterrence and defense, while adding crisis management and partnership as essential to security and stability. The 1999 strategic concept would help prepare the alliance politically and military for what was to come. A new NATO command structure was nearing implementation and envisioned a drastic reduction of NATO military headquarters with a residual focus on collective defense, despite the absence of any specific territorial threat. And allies agreed that year to a new NATO force structure that would provide rapidly deployable multinational forces and greater flexibility for the command and control of NATO operations. Long enduring Balkan operations had proven the need for the rotation of force headquarters and a deeper well to draw from to ensure sustainability. In summary, at the outset of 2001, the NATO military instrument of power was reorienting toward crisis and peace support operations while retaining competency in collective defense, albeit with greatly reduced assets, structure, and funding. Next slide. At the risk of oversimplification, the 20+ years since 2001 have been marked by 5 major inflection points. These inflection points reflected major changes in the Euro-Atlantic security environment, as well as the influence of global factors, and led to significant NATO political and policy decisions impacting military power in terms of missions, operations, structured, and the required capabilities. In the interest of time, I will only cover highlights of these inflection points and their impacts. In the paper I prepared, I go into much more detail. Next slide. For NATO, 11 September was a watershed moment. Allies invoked Article 5 for the first and only time and conducted operations to support the US and to increase maritime security. Allies individually contributed to the US operations in Afghanistan and then to the UN-established International Security Assistance Force. Within 2 years, however, decisions would lead to major changes for NATO military power. First, NATO revised its command structure to reflect the new reality. Allied Command Operations replaced Allied Command Europe and assumed responsibility across the Euro-Atlantic area. 3 joint commands with 6 subordinate component commands were established, and an Allied Command Transformation replaced Allied Command Atlantic with a mission of assessing the need for change and ensuring continuous improvement of Allied military concepts, capabilities, and interoperability, and headquarters strength further reduced. Second, Allies established a NATO response force composed of land, air, maritime, and special forces trained and ready to deploy as a multinational force. And third, Allies agreed to assume command in 2003 and successfully expand the ISAF mission over the entire country. NATO assistance enabled a shift of US military effort from Afghanistan to Iraq. Now, over the remainder of the decade, NATO and national military experience in the long wars and other security operations had transformational effects. Leader and unit proficiency improved in low-intensity conflicts. Doctrine and training focused on expeditionary operations, security assistance, and counterterrorism. Capabilities were tailored to the theater requirements with significant improvements in C4ISR, air-ground coordination, precision strike, special forces capabilities, force protection, biometrics and explosive forensics, expeditionary logistics, and medical support. Interoperability significantly improved as well and focused on the integration of forces and weapons at the lowest tactical level. Generations of officers and members of all services gained a shared operational experience and familiarity with NATO missions, procedures, and structures. As the first decade of the 21st century was ending, a number of Allied decisions were taken with lasting impacts. At the 2008 Bucharest summit, a number of NATO leaders welcomed Ukraine and Georgia to eventually join NATO. A Russia-Georgia war soon followed the same year. In 2009, Allied ministers endorsed a new NATO defense planning process, now capability-based versus force-based, which would improve planning at the strategic level and better integrate national planning. And in 2010, NATO ministers decided to streamline the NATO command structure yet again to achieve greater flexibility, effectiveness, and affordability. The new structure reduced the joint commands to 2 in the Netherlands and in Italy, which was what we have today, and established independent component commands for air, maritime, and land. Next slide. The 2010 Lisbon Summit opened a new decade and debuted a new strategic concept. Allies now numbered 28. The strategic partnership with Russia was cool, difficult, and tense, but peaceful. Main threats included proliferation of nuclear capabilities and other WMD, terrorism, instability, cyber attacks, and threats to vital trade and energy routes. Ballistic missile defense was a priority due to threat from Iran. NATO's new 3 core tasks reflected both continuity and evolution. First, collective defense remained a core task, but not a conventional force priority. 2, NATO militaries focused on crisis management with operations in Europe and abroad. The 3rd core task, cooperative security, was about building capability and interoperability with partners in Europe and beyond for low-intensity conflict. NATO military authorities and national militaries were focused on building and training force structure to sustain rotational requirements, while nations individually were reducing and slimming their own force structure, and in the case of the US and UK, redeploying forces home from Europe. Next slide. Beginning in January and lasting through April 2011, protests, uprisings, and armed rebellions erupted across North Africa to the Middle East. The Arab Spring, it was called, led to Operation Unified Protector in 2011 to implement a UN-sanctioned arms embargo and a no-fly zone in Libya. NATO's experience in Libya highlighted capability shortfalls, which led to actions to improve joint ISR, air-to-air refueling, airlift, and precision-guided munitions. The use of ballistic missiles by the Syrian regime kept NATO focused on its goals for BMD and led to the deployment of missile defense systems to southern Turkey. While instability ran across NATO's south, operational focus remained on ISAF, where a surge was executed from 2010 to 2012. Allies contributed tens of thousands of additional forces, and the surge led to further improvements in operational experience and capabilities, primarily for land, air, and special forces. But it also created strains in terms of costs, readiness offsets, and cuts in combined arms capabilities. The fourth and most important inflection point occurred in 2014 with Russian aggression and the rise of ISIS. Russia illegally annexed Crimea and supported a violent separatist movement in eastern Ukraine. Russia's aggression was accompanied by military modernization, improvements in C2 and readiness, increased frequency and scale of both conventional and nuclear force exercises, increased out-of-area deployments, military buildups to the west and south, support to the Assad regime, permanent presence in the Mediterranean, arms treaty violations, hybrid activities, and malign influence writ large. Near simultaneously, ISIS gained large swaths of territory in Syria and Iraq, then spread to Libya, Yemen, and Afghanistan, and inspired attacks in Europe and North America. The result was regional instability to the south, interventions by Russia and Iran in Syria, large numbers of refugees, large immigration flows to Europe, and insecurity at home. These two elements led to a series of NATO political military responses and the most important military changes since the end of the Cold War. NATO military authorities developed and implemented a new strategy, the first in over 30 years, as well as new concepts, plans, and structure, new military requirements, and a revised training exercise program. NATO leaders in Wales and Warsaw set the conditions for further transformation with a readiness action plan and defense investment pledge. The former composed of assurance and adaptation measures, and the latter aimed at reversing the downward trend of defense spending. And over those two summits and the following three, leaders agreed to improve military readiness, responsiveness, reinforcement, structure, and capabilities, as well as civilian resilience in support of military response. The final inflection point began in late 2019 and is still ongoing. Not as dramatic as previous ones, this inflection point is a result of a convergence of several factors and represents both a new direction and a follow-on to previous developments. As NATO prepared for the London leaders meeting, the atmosphere among allies was tense. Pressures on NATO cohesion came from both beyond and within. The unanimous response from allies was to reinvigorate consultation and recommit to political cohesion and solidarity through a reflection process. At the London leaders meeting in December 2019, allies agreed to the following: to embark on a broad campaign of understanding of and engagement with China, to implement an emerging and disruptive technology roadmap, to support US-Taliban negotiations underway, and pursue a coordinated withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, ultimately, the decision to close resolute support was more unilateral than coordinated and resulted in a hasty evacuation versus a transition to a follow-on civilian mission. And finally, allies agreed to launch a reflection process that culminated in a report by a group of experts in late 2020 and a Secretary General-led NATO 2030 initiative to do three things: improve NATO's political cohesion, improve military capability, and expand external engagement. And finally, during the 2020 reflection process, COVID came to Europe and NATO responded. Next slide. So, ubi nunc sumus? Where are we now? The bottom line is that the NATO military instrument power has come a long way since 2001 in terms of readiness, responsiveness, reinforcement, structure, and capabilities against the threats posed by Russia and international terrorist groups, while perhaps less so against the challenges posed by China, climate change, regional instability, and unexpected strategic shocks like pandemics or future crises. Most of NATO's readiness initiative goals have been met. The crisis response mechanism has been revised. Graduated response plans are complete, and a new SACEUR's AOR-wide strategic plan and associated supporting plans are under development. Revised training and exercise program has been developed and is being further refined to align national, multinational, and NATO events in support of strategic objectives. Military mobility has improved. NATO BMD has capability against limited strikes from Iran. The NATO command structure now includes a Joint Force Command Norfolk and Joint Support and Enablement Command at full operational capability, and new force structure elements have been developed and declared operational. The strategic commands and allied militaries are focused on implementation of a concept for deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area called DDA, and the NATO warfighting capstone concept called NWCC. DDA organizes military power now to implement the new strategy, and the NWCC outlines what operational concepts and capabilities will be needed over the next 2 decades to prepare for future threats and challenges. Cyberspace and space are declared operational domains. However, in terms of allied capabilities, progress is mixed. On the positive side, the agreed capability targets are on track. And additionally, NATO's C4ISR, multinational air-to-air refueling and airlift programs are healthy and growing, and multinational cooperation and capability development has reached new heights. On the negative side, multiple shortfalls and gaps persist, from integrated air missile defense, joint fires and targeting, joint ISR, land enablers, maritime capabilities, to airborne electronic attack and CBRN. And shortfalls also exist in training, readiness, and interoperability, the latter being critical to unite, organize, and integrate forces for collective response. And my last slide, to conclude.
1 minute, sir.
Otendimus. First, with respect to threats and challenges, the alliance has reached consensus on the big items. Russia and international terrorist groups are the pacing threats, followed by cyber, hybrid, and asymmetric threats, and Iran's ballistic missiles and its support to terrorist groups. Challenges include regional stability, instability, climate change and security, Chinese policies and actions that affect the Euro-Atlantic area, autocratic regimes challenging the rules-based order, COVID, other pandemics, and unforeseen strategic shocks. Factors affecting defense resources include domestic needs to support economic recovery, to invest more in advanced civil technologies, to address climate change, immigration, inflation, and more. And US focus on threats outside the Euro-Atlantic area, think of China, North Korea, Iran, could shift US global force posture and affect the balance of European forces commitment to address NATO core tasks. And second, despite or perhaps because of these challenges, the future for NATO military power appears to be bright. The NATO military instrument of power and defense capabilities are prominent in a number of the NATO 2030 work strands, especially strengthening deterrence and defense and fostering innovation and technological cooperation. With this cautiously optimistic outlook, the latest military transformation underway requires follow-through and sustained resourcing. Reinforcing NATO's military power will likely be part of the next strategic concept expected this year, including the need to resource a new level of political ambition. With that, I'll close and pass the floor back to John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. We have a question to start off our Q&A from Mark Wilcox. The Russians would undoubtedly argue that the various tranches of NATO enlargement constituted a significant inflection point in European security. Could the enlargement of the alliance have been handled differently? For instance, by making better use of the Partnership for Peace program to better manage the tempo of enlargement?
Okay, thanks for the question, Mark. I would say that the expansion certainly didn't happen overnight. It really happened over 20 years, from 2000 all the way to from the mid 90s all the way to 2000 and frankly 2020, with the latest being North Macedonia. The most important Central Eastern and Northern Eastern, Southeastern were all joined by 2009, which is still 20 years after the end of the Cold War Cold War. So it certainly wasn't rapid. I think the most important thing for allies, and certainly for the aspiring members that eventually joined, was the need to feel protected from a potential revanchist Russia, which was not necessarily foreseen in the 90s, but obviously became clearer and clearer after 2008. But by 2009, the vast majority, 28 had already, not 28, but additional 12 had already joined NATO by 2009. And so the other point is that the open door policy of NATO, which is Article 10, was written in 1949. And that is that any nation can aspire to be a member as long as it embraces the values of the Washington Treaty, as long as it has a democratic system of government and military, which is responsive to civilian power and can be a contributor to European security. And so, membership was not necessarily handed out for those standing in line. It was a process of a very long and detailed membership action plan for each one of the aspiring member countries. Some were able to meet those expectations within a year or two. Others took up to 10 or 15 years of concerted effort to reach that level. So I think in terms of the way NATO would look at it, and certainly the way I do, is that it was handled responsively and slowly over time. Of course, there's a different view in Moscow, but at the same time, I think from the allies who've joined, I don't think that any of them would want to do it had it a different way. I'll stop there.
Okay. We have another question from James Farrell. Why does Russia appear not to fear NATO?
Okay, I'm not sure I'd agree with the premise, but because I think that their actions demonstrate that they're very fearful of NATO from many different points of view. First, as an example of democratic and economic progress, a different rules-based order, a different system of government and military that threatens the regime and frankly the personal values of Putin and the oligarchs that run Russia. And so their actions from disinformation to all their malign influence, which I outlined in one of my points about 2014, other changes in Russian behavior, I think directly reflect that they fear NATO not so much as an invader, as in times of czarist regimes or even Stalin, so much as an alternative model of government and life that threatens the way Putin controls both the people and the government. So I think that's the major issue. And I think that what we're seeing in terms of most recent Russian demands for no further extension, for withdrawal of forces from former Soviet republics, et cetera, and of course, no entry of Ukraine into NATO as a guarantee, all reflect this concern that the closer NATO is to Russian territory, the easier it is for the Russian public to perceive and see, and I think undermine the Putin narrative. So those are my thoughts.
Okay. Related to that, then, sir, in light of the current Russian crisis in Ukraine, is NATO or NATO forces prepared for those eventualities?
So there's lots of eventualities we could talk about here, but what most people have talked about is the worst possible case is invasion of Russia into Ukraine. Personally, I think that's very unlikely for lots of reasons, primarily because of the cost, both during such invasion, but even after the invasion or during it, I should say, and afterwards for Putin, for Russia, and the likely backlash, not just from economic sanctions, which will bite into Putin's elite circle and himself personally, but will also cause a backlash within the Russian people. There's been many recent surveys talking about the fact that the Russian people are not excited about attacking what they see as a friendly neighbor and what they see as a part of the Russian Brotherhood, Ukraine. And so I think those are calculations that need to be taken into account. And I also think that the economic sanctions are not small and would be occurred at great cost. And of course, casualties that would occur would be another thing that would cause backlash within Russia. That said, NATO is responding in the way I think, and it says it needs to. First off, it needs to engage. It tries to engage Russia to de-escalate, which is what its political efforts have been focused on since mid-December. And it's gone through a whole series of internal consultations, engagements with Ukraine, and engagements with Russia at various levels, and just to make sure that there's a unity of effort and communications. And second, it's assured its allies that feel the most threatened, and those being the ones on the Russian border, on the Belarus border, or close, in terms of maritime contact like Bulgaria and Romania. And so that's why you see forces being deployed to those areas by the US, by other allies that are underway or actually already completed. And then finally, it's supporting Ukraine because it's been a partner, an active partner for 20 plus years, actually since the late 90s. And then more recently, since 2014, with the Poroshenko and then more recently with the Zelensky government, has been a very strong reformer. Now, not so much in the Poroshenko era. There were some efforts, probably mostly focused on balancing the financial situation in Ukraine. But with the Zelensky, there's been a dramatic shift in terms of increased efforts to reform the government, laws, conditions, defense industry, and of course, defense forces. And they've also gained years of experience in fighting on the Eastern Front. And I think what we see in Ukraine right now is that they're concerned about, most of the economic impact of the threat, and also concerned about a fight that they wouldn't necessarily be able to win, but they would have to probably transition to civilian resistance quite quickly, and they're organizing that way. So I think that there's NATO's done those three things: support the partner, reassure allies, and then engage NATO and engage Russia. And I think that the eventuality of an invasion won't necessarily require a military response. It will require that political, economic, financial response that we talked about.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and it comes from Tony Mullis. How do Ukrainian desires fit into the current crisis? If they want to join NATO and meet entry criteria, should they be allowed to join?
Okay, so the allies have in fact reaffirmed over and over again that the open door policy remains extant, that they've re-endorsed it. They're not going to change it. They have engaged Ukraine over and over again, welcoming them for the reform efforts. There are still a lot of concerns in terms of ability to retain classified information and secure their own nets. Cybersecurity is a concern because of infiltration by Russia, and also quite a few of sympathizers still throughout the nation, not large numbers, but enough to cause a problem and concern for security efforts. And they still have a long way to go in terms of military reform and democratic reform. They're on very good progress, but they're not going to meet the NATO expectations overnight. That's still going to take several years. So the biggest issue is, will Russia ever accept the fact that Ukraine could be a member of NATO and that NATO is not an offensive threat to Russian territory? It is a threat to the Russian model of government by its pure example of economic prosperity. And so that's the concern. Now, what we heard 3 or 4 days ago was Putin saying that, well, if Ukraine joined, they could then reclaim Crimea. No big surprise there, because they want to regain complete territorial control. But the issue of Crimea could be settled for an agreement to have Russian forces on Crimean bases for their access to the Black Sea. There could be coexistence. That's not currently in the mind of Putin, but that is in the mind of allies, and they're focused right now on kind of developing transparency and confidence building measures, as well as getting back to arms conventions and treaties.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate your comments and your answers. Okay, we have to move on to our last speaker, who is Lieutenant Colonel retired Lester Grau, who is a senior analyst at the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command's Foreign Military Studies Office here at Fort Leavenworth. Les Grau has served U.S. Army for 52 years, retiring as an infantry lieutenant colonel and continuing service through research and teaching in Army professional military education. His on-the-ground service spanned the Vietnam War to Cold War assignments in Europe, Vietnam, Korea, and the Soviet Union to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He has conducted various assignments in Russia, including collaborative research with the Russian General Staff's Military History Institute and with other Russian military officials. He has also conducted collaborative research in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and with numerous organizations in Europe. He is the author of 18 books and 250 articles and studies on tactical, operational, and geopolitical subjects. Dr. Grau, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much.
I'll share your slides.
We'll save my slides to the end.
You can save your slides to the end. Okay,
Yes.
go ahead.
And I want to thank General Davis for making my task a little easier by going over the NATO side of things, because I'm going to talk about Russia's reaction to NATO and why do they think that way. And I'm not Russian, but this is what I perceive is what's driving them. And so I'm presenting their ideas. And Russia's reaction to NATO's development since the end of the Cold War has evolved from their own perspectives of geography, history, and specific key events that made up the dissolution of the Soviet Union and its aftermath. As the Warsaw Pact disintegrated, Germany wanted to reunite, and this was not a welcome situation for the Soviet Union. Their key enemy from World War II wanted to get together again, and they were very much opposed to this. And Secretary of State James Baker went to General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze on 9 September 1990 and made a statement that there will be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction or NATO's forces 1 inch to the east. And as history has shown, it hasn't been an inch, it's been more like 1,000 kilometers. And Russia's they're a bit paranoid, but just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. This is their reaction. Russia has fought with all of its neighbors, and many of its non-neighbors have gone out of their way to fight Russia. These include the Mongols, Swedes, Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, Saxony, Prussia, China, France, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, Great Britain, Romania, Turkey, Japan, Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the United States, Finland, Communist China, and Afghanistan. And Russia has usually fought with its back to or in Mother Russia. For many Russians today, Russia's historic enemies are still potential enemies today, opposing Russia's goals and ambitions. Moreover, the most recent of these invaders have come from the West. Now, in order to assuage and pacify the Soviet and later Russian leaders, US President George H.W. Bush, West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, the US Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, French President Francois Mitterrand, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the British Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd, the British Prime Minister John Major, and the NATO General Secretary Manfred Werner all made similar assurances throughout 1990 and 1991 to the Soviet leadership and made statements about protecting Soviet security interests, including the USSR, in the new European security structure. When the Soviet Empire dissolved in December 1991, the world discovered that the world's third largest nuclear power was Ukraine, and the fourth was Kazakhstan. There were over 3,000 Soviet strategic nuclear warheads and another 3,000 plus tactical nuclear warheads on the territories of the newly independent states of Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus. There were very serious concerns about this. The United States and Russia got together on this, and by the close of 1992, the tactical nukes were under control, and 1996, all the strategic warheads were in Russia under Russian control. And this was a result of a series of mutual inspections and exchanges by Russia and the United States. This was a good start. When empires collapse, there's turmoil, and there was certainly turmoil involved in the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact disappeared, and with it, the buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the West. The Soviet Union was truncated, and about a third of its landmass and population split off voluntarily or was pushed out by Russia. With the departure of Central Asia and the South Caucasus Republic, a vital Russian southern buffer zone was lost. Economically vital Chechnya declared independence, leading to civil war. The value of the ruble plummeted, and pensioners discovered that their life savings were wiped out. The all-important social welfare net dissolved. Western economists were dispatched to revive the dying ruble, but they applied Western solutions to a non-Western economic system and aided in the death of the ruble. Things were not looking good for Russia. The United States and Russian militaries were making cautious overtures toward joint military education, training, and exercises. Former Soviet allies were interested in distancing themselves from Russia and the Russian military, and were looking for partnerships and alliances with the West. In 1992, fighting broke out in Bosnia and Herzegovina and threatened to spread. On October 1993, Secretary of State Warren Christopher met with Russian President Boris Yeltsin to discuss the Partnership for Peace program. Christopher assured Yeltsin that the new Partnership for Peace program was about including Russia together with all European countries, not creating a new membership of just some European countries for NATO. Yeltsin responded that this is genius. He understood that PFP was about creating an inclusive alternative to NATO. The US, however, saw PFP as leading to the gradual expansion of NATO. And there is part of the problem. As the situation worsened in Bosnia, NATO deployed Multinational Division North, also known as Task Force Eagle, to Bosnia. It consisted of the 1st and 2nd Brigades of the US Armored Division, a separate airborne brigade of the Russian Airborne Forces, and a Nordic Polish brigade composed of several nations. They worked together well. It seemed to be working. However, on March 24th, 1999, NATO launched its controversial air campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. It was controversial since the UN Security Council would not endorse the legitimacy of the intervention, and Russia saw this as an illegal intervention. The Kosovo war started on 28 February 1998 and was fought by troops of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, primarily Serbia and Montenegro, and the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was an Albanian separatist group. NATO's 3-day air campaign expanded to 78 days and trying to destroy the army of Yugoslavia, which had gone into hiding. And finally, after 78 days, through the good services of the Finns and the Russians, we were able to bring it to a close. Now came the time for the occupation of former Yugoslavia. Russia expected to get its own peacekeeping zone in the area. NATO did not see it that way. They did not want to. They wanted to not have a buffer between the Serbs and the Albanians. And so the NATO concern was that this could lead to a partitioned Kosovo with a Serbian-controlled north and an Albanian south. And a Russian force of 250 paratroopers and 30 vehicles occupied the airport on 30 June 1999, the day before the NATO force was expected to arrive. This created a variety of problems, and Russia and Serbian relationships go back to the Middle Ages, and Serbia is one of Russia's oldest allies. If you remember World War I and how it got started, the strong ties between Serbia and Russia were certainly a key factor in the rapid escalation of the road to war. The Russian leadership saw the Partnership for Peace as a substitute for NATO. NATO members saw it differently. And on 12 March 1999, the former Warsaw Pact allies, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined NATO. None of their territory touched the borders of Russia, but NATO had clearly extended a lot further than its 1 inch. Russia objected, but Russia was not doing well economically. They were the laughingstock of Europe. And on 29 March 2004, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia joined NATO. Bulgaria and Romania bordered the Black Sea. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were former Soviet socialist republics within the Soviet Union. And apparently, Russia had crossed a red line NATO had crossed a red line with Russia when it incorporated states that were formerly part of the Soviet Union or bordered on Russia. Russia had changed remarkably over the past 5 years. Vladimir Putin had won his second term as Russian president, and Putin was making steady progress in Chechnya with his second war, and had accomplished wonders with the Russian economy. The gross domestic product grew steadily. Industrial production mounted as the Russian economy went from 22nd to 11th largest in the world by 2007. And the average annual income of the Russian citizens increased 8-fold. And 7 to 12 August 2008, Russia and Georgia had a short decisive conflict. It was not well done, but Russia was much larger than Georgia, and Georgia had been actively seeking NATO membership and sought NATO aid during and after the conflict. Ukraine, the Russian state, began in Kiev, and the Slavic peoples of Russia and Ukraine spent most of their post-medieval history united as a single state. While part of Ukraine wanted close economic ties with the West and integration into the Western European system, another part of Ukraine preferred to retain its special relation with Russia. The part that wanted integration with Western Europe also wanted membership with NATO. Russia has fewer allies than it did during the Soviet Union, and its client states are disappearing. The color revolutions that swept the former Warsaw Pact states, the the republics, and Western and the Middle East are perceived as a US conceived and sponsored program of democratic institution building designed to isolate Russia and threaten Russian stability by itself. By 2020, NATO had expanded from 16 to 30 member nations, and another 20 nations are members of the NATO PFP program, many of them hoping to join NATO. By the way, one of the first countries to join PFP was Russia. But for Russia, this is seen as an invasion in slow motion that harkened back to the same competition before. And if you could put up the Winston Churchill slide for me, John. In 1939, Churchill made this famous statement on the radio: "I cannot foresee to you the actions of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, but perhaps there is a key. That key is Russian national interest. It cannot be in accordance with the interest of the safety of Russia that Germany should plant itself upon the shores of the Black Sea, or that it should overrun the Balkan states and subject the Slavonic peoples of Southeastern Europe. That would be contrary to the historic life interests of Russia. If you cross out Germany and put in US NATO, they are further than Germany was at the time Churchill made this statement. And that final slide, please, John. And when Russia looks at itself, you can see the NATO membership, the Partnership for Peace, the NATO action programs, NATO membership, etc. And out in the periphery, you have the countries that have undergone color revolutions, and Russia feels threatened. And so I would like to conclude by saying Russia does feel threatened. NATO is closer to its borders. It sees this as a threat to our well-being. And right now we are in interesting times. And I think I'm at my time today.
Okay, thank you very much, Les. I appreciate that. Do we have any, just a reminder to go ahead and place your questions in the chat if you have them. There are a couple comments in there, one by General Davis, the other by Mark Wilcox about the Baker promise to Gorbachev, as it's known. But I'll start off the questions with, what do you think Putin is doing in Ukraine? What does he hope to gain?
Well, quite frankly, I think Putin may have reached what he wanted to accomplish in the first place. He announced that he was going to conduct a military exercise. He has conducted that military exercise and continues to conduct it. The West has responded by heightened alert by sending additional troops to Europe. The United States is evacuating non-essential personnel from the embassy. But does this go any further? I don't know. But I think it's within the. I think it presents the opportunity to come to an agreement, and I think Putin has made his points rather clear on what he hopes to get out of this.
Do you think our sanctions on against Russia is going to cause them to act any differently?
We have had a series of sanctions running against Russia for years, and some of them have slowed down production of some of their military equipment, but they have developed a series of workarounds, and some of our European allies seem to be a little tired of continuing the sanctions regime. There, of course, is the question of energy. Russia has been very careful not to tamper with the energy supply to Europe. I think to do so could create economic crisis in Europe, and of course a cold winter. But the winter is coming to an end. So far, Russia has been able to develop workarounds, and so would further sanctions have much effect? I don't know, but I don't think they feel as threatened by them as we feel they are a threat.
Okay, sure. General Davis, you had a comment on energy?
Thanks, John. Just a quick comment, and then I'll have a question for Les if I could follow on.
Sure.
The question or the comment I had based on a number of engagements recently with energy experts, primarily in Europe, both German and Northeastern. They've made the point that in terms of the overall numbers, the European countries writ large, that's either EU member states, NATO allies, or even non-aligned, roughly take in about 40% of the collective needs for gas and oil from Russia. That's a significant amount, and that would not be easily replaced by alternative sources that they're looking at right now, which of course the US is actively trying to assist allies in the EU to pursue. But more importantly, 60% of Russia's revenues from exported oil and gas come from European states. So as many European states would want to sanction, could actually create a greater backlash to Russia in terms of lost revenues than the lost gas and oil would affect European allies. That's been posited by a number of from energy experts. So that's just one point. So it's a double-edged sword is the bottom line. Yeah. And my question for Les is, do you think that what Russia has achieved to date, and this is where you were getting to in your last comments from the question, are good enough to go back to the Russian public in terms of, I've had both EU, the current leader of the council being Macron, and then a number of individual states outreach to me, US, et cetera, have come to me willing to talk about my security interests, although they haven't addressed my specific demands. Do you think he can turn that into a semi-win, or does he need more right now to really de-escalate following the exercises in Belarus and that are ongoing?
Well, Putin has had a long run, and surprisingly has retained more popularity over that long run than one could expect. However, there are significant people in the parts of the Russian population, particularly among the young, that look to the West as maybe a preferable way that they would like to live. So that there is an underpinning. I think one of the things, however, is that we gauge everything by the US dollar in our economic figures and all. But Russia runs off the ruble. They can produce things that cost less, that they can produce it in rubles. They've managed to get a fairly decent economy going. Can he continue this is a question. Will he continue to enjoy his support? And then again, though Russia is certainly far more democratic than it was under Soviet days, I wouldn't classify it by a full democracy under any terms. It's a very Russian state. So I have the same questions that you do, sir.
John, question from Arizona.
Yeah, please.
Les, is there a possibility, and this may be crystal balling it, is there a possibility of what we're seeing with the young Russians now looking toward the West as a return to perhaps the Bush the elder administration's view of Mr. Gorbachev or Mr. Shevardnadze as a new type of Russian who seems to be, I say that in quotes, but he seems to be more open-minded, fair-minded, willing to get on to working in a new world. Do you think coming about?
Well, he still looks better with his shirt off than I do, but he doesn't have that popular appeal anymore. The same following, but I think Putin is remembered as the guy who brought pride and respect back to Russia. Russia was a laughing stock. All they were exporting was energy and wood. Nobody was buying Russian-made products, and now, 20 years later, everybody's showing some respect to Russia. And I think one of the major problems that Russia has had when Putin came into power was there was no respect. And Russia has forced the rest of the world, particularly Europe, to show some respect and to pay some attention. And it hasn't been an easy thing. Where this will go, will Putin become czar for life, or will he step down at this next point? If so, who will succeed him? There's some factions that are speaking out against the continued Putin leadership. Some of the Russians I talk to are not particularly happy, but they see that their life is definitely improved under him, and he still gets a great deal of credit for that. And I don't know if that answers the question or not. I'm just saying, I'm guessing he might declare the exercise is over and we're going home now, and I've made my point. Or we may drag this thing out for a couple more months. It's hard to say.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, and thanks to all of our speakers. We're out of time, and I'm going to go into hit the last little bit of admin here before I turn it over to Bob. If you did miss either of the first two, or you want to watch this recording, you can find them on our webpage. You can see right where they are under the media tab. You'll see Cold War Symposiums. Click there and take you right to our YouTube page. The link to the Simon Center page is right there. If you can look for our book in late spring or summer. We're targeting June to try to get this out, where we will capture all of the papers from the Cold War Symposium from our authors. And if you do have any other questions, you can see my contact information there at the bottom. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'll leave this up for a second. So if you needed to write something down, and then I'll turn it over to you, Bob.
Thank you, John. First of all, I want to thank all of the contributors and all the sessions that we've had on this Cold War Symposium. The key was to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union and the reorganization of NATO. I was at NATO headquarters when the wall came down. In fact, I supported the summit by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher in '88, and then a follow-on summit in 1989 when George H.W. Bush was president. And I can tell you that NATO was caught off guard by the fact that the Soviet Union had disintegrated. It was chaotic. In fact, we started questioning what is the reason for being of NATO. Many argued that NATO ought to go away since the Soviet Union had collapsed. I do remember one statement by Mikhail Gorbachev that rang true. He said, "You're going to miss us when we're gone," because we had a unitary threat to face. We looked at the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden, seems like the world exploded, transnational actors and so on. And Skip's presentation showed all the various things that NATO has been involved in over the years, none of which were contemplated when NATO was established or when prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. So it has been a very interesting time that we've lived in. What I wanted to do is tell each one of you that we have your email address, and I'm going to be sending you a copy of the latest progress report for the Simon Center 2021. It lays out a number of the programs that we've done, but it also talks about a new podcast series that we've started through the Simon Center. It's the Bull Simon's Op Center podcast. We have a podcast with Terry Buckler, who was the youngest member of the Sante raid to go into North Vietnam back in November of 1970. He was 20 years old at the time, a sergeant, never been in combat before, and the next thing you know, he's going into North Vietnam. There is an episode with Bill Eckhart, who was prosecutor of the My Lai massacre. Those of you who remember that period, Bill's podcast is very interesting. And then the third one that we have up there now is General Stan Cherry, And of course, Stan not only fought in Vietnam, but he was in Bosnia and the first Gulf War. And so he has an interesting story to tell. We're going to be featuring stories like this throughout the year. And we have a number of others scheduled. It's just one of the ways that we have kind of transformed the Simon Center to do two things. Number one, to tell the story or to help people understand the importance of interagency cooperation, but also focus on ethical leadership. And we're going to have a conference in the near future that deals with ethical leadership and pull in some subject matter experts like we have here today to talk about issues dealing with ethical leadership and the importance of it. I want to thank you all for participating in the series. It's been a pleasure to have you on board, and I hope that you enjoyed this program that we put together for you. That ends our session for today, so thanks very much.